May God open our eyes to see, our ears to hear, our hearts to love. Hannah's story is told in turbulent times, at the end of the period of the Judges, when we are told that people had lost sight of a collective vision. And the Bible says that each did what they thought was right in their own eyes. In time, Hannah's child Samuel will be the one who will anoint King David, the first monarch, reflecting a yearning for stability and reconnection with spirit. Turbulent times, wars and rumours of wars, false prophets, news of end times. The writer of Mark's Gospel also lived in turbulent times, and his readers sought to make sense of the destruction of Jerusalem and the calls to join the wars that raged around them. Turbulent times. Yesterday, many of us were horrified to hear about the appalling attack on Paris, presumably inspired and orchestrated by ISIL. As residents of a global Western city, we can relate to the horror of violence, which is usually so far away from our shores, erupting in our midst. Yesterday afternoon, Sydney people gathered in Martin Place to lament the violence, to pray for Paris. Martin Place, where nearly a year ago, random violence disturbed our peace and took the lives of 2 hostages and the hostage taker. Yesterday morning, I turned on the television news. I also looked at Facebook for news of Georgia, a young woman who grew up in St Andrews in the Terrace in Wellington, whose parents, Ben and Lynn, joined us at worship last Sunday here at Pitt Street. Georgia now lives in Paris with her boyfriend, Clément. They live close to the scenes of the carnage, but through Facebook, thankfully, we found out that they were at home and were safe. It was also through social media that I learned that the day before there had been a terrible suicide bombing in Beirut, Lebanon. But until it was seen through the lens of what was happening in Paris, Beirut was almost invisible to Western eyes. These things happen all the time in the Middle East. The violent disruption of their world has become normalised for us. On Friday, our time, 43 people were killed in Beirut. 240 injured. Most of us didn't notice. I am glad that the New South Wales government is standing in solidarity with the people of Paris, but we all know that the flag of Lebanon will not be flown on the harbour bridge, and the Opera House will not feature the cedar tree of the Lebanese flag surrounded by white and red. But really, this sermon is not going to be about the violence of terrorism. But I felt that it was important to say again, in this context, on this day, that all life is valuable, that no one religion or ideology bears all the responsibility for violence, and that the relationship between religion, politics, and violence is profoundly complex. And I think if you want to read more about that, about the connections of religion and violence and the disconnections, I recommend Karen Armstrong's most recent book. But today I want to focus on a not unrelated theme, a theme that has captured the imagination of human beings for a very long time, that of the end times. The strangest manifestation of interest in the end of history in our time among fundamentalist Christians is seen in the left behind industry, which focuses on the rapture. The rapture is supposedly when all the Christians will be taken directly up to heaven. I don't think they mean our kind of Christians either. Meeting Jesus in the clouds. Everyone else will be apparently left here for 7 years of tribulation. And so these thoughtful people who know it all have written out the details of how to become Christian before it's finally too late for the rest of us. End-time fascination ebbs and flows, but there is always someone or some group predicting that it's about to happen any minute, and drawing on the Bible or other sacred texts to prove their point. Reading an apocalyptic chapter like Mark chapter 13 reminds me of a couple of Peanuts comic strips starring Charlie Brown that I saw quite a few years ago now. First, Linus and Charlie Brown are reading a nursery rhyme. Linus, who purports to be the resident theologian for Peanuts, says, "The way I see it, the cow jumped over the moon indicates an increase in farm prices. The part about the dish running away with the spoon must refer to what's happening with consumers. Do you agree with me, Charlie Brown?" Charlie Brown replies, "I don't pretend to be a student of prophetic literature." In the second strip, Lucy is looking out the window with a worried look on her face. "It sure has been raining a long time," she says to Linus. "Do you think it's going to flood the earth again?" Linus says, "No, God promised that this wouldn't happen again, and the rainbow is a sign of that." "That sure takes a load off my mind," Lucy says. "Sound theology has a way of doing that," Linus replies. Presumably Linus has moved on from his interpretation of the cow jumping over the moon at this point. Well, in fact, there are lots of people who have pretended to be students of prophetic literature. All too often they interpret it with as much sophistication as Linus's reading of Mother Goose. What we need, the later Linus says, is sound theology. Sound theology does take a load off our minds, but it also puts responsibility on our shoulders. The 13th chapter of Mark is a goldmine for people fascinated by the end of the world. It figures prominently in the books by doomsayers and sermons by evangelists, more interested in the next world than in this one. On the other hand, the chapter is largely ignored by pragmatists, activists, believers in progress, who all dismiss preoccupation with the end of the world as a juvenile state of human development and an aberration of unbalanced minds. The chapter of Mark, known as the Little Apocalypse, is unlike anything else in the Gospel of Mark. Even the structure is different. It is a long discourse that strings together many quotes of or allusions to Hebrew Bible apocalyptic readings. It's certainly the longest sustained discourse that Jesus speaks in this Gospel. We really have no way of knowing how much, if any, of this discourse was actually grounded in what Jesus taught. In a very real sense, we can look at this chapter not from the standpoint of Jesus talking about some distant events in the future, but of events which actually did happen after his death. The chapter begins with Jesus' remarks about the magnificent temple that Herod had built, which was started in 20 BCE and probably was still under construction in the days of Jesus. The disciples are really impressed by it. Jesus tells them not to be. As we saw last week in the story of the widow's mite, Jesus was a serious critic of the abuses of temple religion. Mark has Jesus predict what he sees ahead for the temple and Jerusalem: war, famine, destruction, all of which did actually happen in the Roman Jewish wars of 66 to 70 in the Common Era, when the temple was destroyed. So one does not have to project everything that Jesus says here into some faraway future for it to make sense. This is one of the critical mistakes that most popular interpreters make when reading these passages. They ignore the original context in which things were said and written. And when we do that, we can make them mean just about anything we wish, just like Linus in the nursery rhyme. This is not to say that the passage has nothing to do with the end time, but what is said is not at all clear, and no timetables are given. If you come to this passage expecting a crystal ball vision, you will not find it. The danger in dealing with such a topic is that people can easily become obsessed by it. One example is the popular Left Behind series, which I mentioned earlier, which is not only books, but movies and video games. Millions of copies have been sold, making the authors multi-millionaires. The books written for adults have been serialized for children, and they take bits and pieces of various parts of the Bible and put them together into works of fiction, which are now taken as fact by many people. It seems that interpreting the book of Revelation or Mark chapter 13 is much more appealing than living out the way of Jesus here and now. When I read and hear some of the people who are obsessed with the end times today, I see very little humility. 20th century US ethicist Reinhold Niebuhr once said, "There are people who claim to know the furniture of heaven and the temperature of hell." And that quote reminds me of another cartoon that I saw in a Far Side calendar. It's coffee break in hell. In the background you can see the pits of fire. Malevolent devils are on guard, and people are queuing up at an urn holding out their mugs. The guy sipping his drink of coffee cries out, "Oh man, the coffee's cold. They've thought of everything." I think in my version of hell I would have to say, "Oh man, the coffee's instant. They've thought of everything." The problem with certainty about the furniture of heaven and the temperature of hell is that people can so easily be led into either unnecessary fear or unfounded security. But the other extreme is to dismiss these teachings, which I think is my natural inclination. But to dismiss them as meaningless may cause us to miss their significance. On reflection, I think that the real message here is that Jesus tells us to wait, to watch for opportunities to proclaim and live out the gospel everywhere and in every chance we get. What we are called to do is to concentrate on the world around us, on the pain here now, on those who are already left behind, reaching out to them with the love and grace of God. How at odds all this focus on heaven and hell is with Jesus, who lived his life with compassion for everyone, who took on the political and religious system that entrenched poverty and violence. How at odds with his words that far from escaping suffering, his followers would face it also. The words of Jesus here echo in light of such things. Take heed. Do not believe it. The end is not yet. These are but the birth pangs. I do not know what the future holds. I am wary of anyone who claims to know more than they can know. Jesus seems to be telling us to pay more attention to the present than to stand with our heads in cloudy visions of the future. For what's most important is our being faithful disciples in the present. That, in the end, is the only real way that we can watch and wait and work toward the future. And that may also greatly impact and shape the future that we face. It is a call to live a life of anticipation, of awareness of the power of God present and active in the world, and lives lived with a commitment to justice and peace, and making sure that we are part of that good energy. It is being satisfied with the knowledge that sacred energy is with us in the here and now, working for peace, reconciliation, and wholeness in human and planetary life. A sure sign that we are on the right path of discipleship is that we are so busy loving God and loving our neighbour that we do not have time to speculate about a far-off future. We are too busy trying to work in the present to make it, in the future, better for all God's children. For us at Pitt Street, this includes participating in campaigns such as the Campaign for Climate Justice. Because if there is a real threat to the well-being and future of the world, it is surely the vulnerability that we have created through our mindless and relentless carbon emissions. Today, I'm not sure whether the UN climate talks will go ahead in Paris in December, but yesterday I heard political leaders saying they will not be cowed into avoiding addressing the very real possibility of future disaster that not attending to climate change presents. Whatever does or does not happen in Paris, the global movement of people's voices and bodies will be a strong living commitment to a just and sustainable future when we join with millions of people around the world in the People's Climate March on the 29th of November, highlighting public concern about climate change. The Pitt Street Mission and Justice team, and with the support of the Church Council, have committed that 50 of us, that's about half of those of us who are here, will be part of that march. Our church will be a venue for a prayer service at noon on that day. It's a half-hour service, And I'm a bit horrified and excited to hear that my co-organisers think that we possibly could have 1,000 people attending that prayer service before we walk together to St Mary's, where we will join the Catholic community and on to the Domain. The Uniting Church at state and national level is firmly behind our participation in the march. Since its foundation almost 40 years ago, the Uniting Church has repeatedly voiced its concern for the well-being of the planet and the right of future generations to enjoy our natural environment. So we will join with many others from many parts of Australian society to express our concern for the whole creation. This is also for us an important action we take in solidarity with our Pacific and other international partner churches. The Uniting Church declared climate change a serious threat to the future of life on Earth in 2006, and in the years since, most national and state councils of the Church have divested from corporations engaging in fossil fuel extraction. Recently, National Director of Uniting Justice Australia, Reverend Eleni Poulos, urged the Australian Government to lift its commitment to global efforts to address climate change. She has said, Australia's announced emissions reduction target of 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2030 remains well short of the level experts say is required to reverse the effects of climate change. She went on to say that there is still time for the Australian Government to put a more ambitious target on the table in Paris, and we, the Uniting Church, should be doing what we can to encourage our government to aim higher. Uniting World National Director Rob Floyd has said that partner churches across the Pacific welcome the support for a stronger global response. The message to the world by Pacific leaders is clear. It is our responsibility as stewards and custodians of the earth to respond ethically. Small island states are already suffering the impacts of climate change, and we need a concerted international effort to address this very real threat to humanity. This seems to me to be the kind of future focus that Christians should be engaging in, rather than worrying about what will happen to the passengers of a jet piloted by a born-again Christian who will be taken up at the time of the rapture. I kid you not, this is a serious concern for fans of rapture theology. To make momentous change happen, or to stand firm in tumultuous time, requires faith that God works in and through history in partnership with creation. To persevere for movements of justice for the expendable people of the world, or to work for a new kind of justice, requires more than optimism. It asks not for faith in human systems, but rather faith in the God who reverses old injustices and brings new life. Faith also in the capacity of God's human creatures to live peacefully and creatively on earth, and a commitment to join with the Spirit of life in turning our world around. So may it be.